Hello, all. Welcome to another episode of CAPISAR Podcast. And I have with me astrologers S.J. Anderson and Greg Crawford to continue our discussion about the blending or integration of modern and traditional astrology. So, in the previous episode, we discussed about the philosophical roots of both modern and traditional astrology, and we tried to kind of tie some ropes into understanding how there is not a lot of difference between the philosophical underpinnings of both modern and traditional astrology, as much as we would like to differentiate both of those. So we looked at the ancient perspectives and contemporary perspectives, and also the ability of astrologers to approach the philosophical ideas with little bit of nuances. I think we got into some Plato, Aristotle discussions, and then we also entered Carl Jung and other some of the modern thinkers such as Dane Rudyard. So we spoke about self actualization or personality development through astrology, and also predictive dimensions, whether it is deterministic or partially deterministic. We touched upon those topics. And then we covered overall understanding of the philosophical dimensions and what astrology is really useful for from a philosophical perspective. And with that, we kind of ended the episode one. And today we are trying to continue with that. But and since we already discussed about the need to understand that there are two dimensions, one is modern and another is traditional, uh, it kind of becomes little bit uh, you know um, it's kind of important to get into the technical aspects and practical applications of how both modern and traditional techniques are used, and what are the future possibilities as well. Because since the advent of the translation projects, from at least from the background much earlier than the early 90s, we had this running from early 90s, and now we all have a lot of access to a lot of ancient texts and medieval texts and astrologers, rather than the generation where astrologers got into modern astrology primarily. Today the scene is changing, where astrologers are entering directly into traditional astrology first, and then jump into modern astrology, thanks to a lot of YouTube channels and podcasts and translation projects that are kind of leading the show in terms of preserving the ancient traditions. So coming to techniques, like I think the first place to start is basically uh, the whether it is predictive or psychological or evolutionary. So still there is little bit of philosophical touches that we need to give, although we touched upon. I think it's still somewhere important. We spoke about this in the last session, where uh, uh, we we kind of tried to lay the ground that not everything is possible as far as prediction is concerned, but also there are scenarios where prediction becomes important, and it is also very much possible. uh, so thanks SJ and Gray for joining for another episode. So I think this is a good place to start.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. So yeah, prediction and you know uh, psychological or evolutionary development. So some astrologers lean towards psychological and evolutionary forms of astrology, and they don't oppose predictions in general, but I think they are more focused on the inner work of the client or the seeker. But on the other hand, there is the other group which kind of lays emphasis on the predictive part, and feels that understanding the immediate mundane surroundings and events of a person's life is of immense value. So I feel there is some integration that is really necessary, because I also kind of tend to, especially from transit's perspective, I know that in one of the episodes that Chris Brennan did with Robert Hand, I think it's episode 12, but I'm not very sure about it. Blending modern and traditional astrology, where Robert Hand said that it is important to note that we have to internalize transits, because that is where we feel So the first effect, whether it is happening at event manifestation level in all our lives or not, but somehow we kind of feel it internally. There is this uh, effect that happens to us. So I think we were just talking about the Saturn Mars opposition that is kind of perfecting tomorrow in terms of how it is playing around already. So, and it might not kind of result in major events in our life, but somewhere down the line we are kind of feeling it internally, and at least that is where we kind of need to integrate a little bit of psychological and also maybe evolutionary elements to uh, you know our predictive astrological thing, because I talk from that perspective because I come from that school, and for me, objective analysis of a chart is really important. So I will leave it to you to kind of dissect, uh, both these things and try to bring together.
You want to go ahead, Greg? Go ahead, please. Yeah.
I can, yeah, sure. I can go. I mean, yeah, it's a big question. And I mean, I think this is where people's orientation to astrology really comes in, because different astrologers will take really different approaches. I think in the last episode I mentioned, I know there's some astrologers that will not make a prediction. Like they don't believe that's something they should even do. Not even that they might not be able to make a prediction. It's like an ethical choice on that, from that practitioner's philosophy, that they should not be telling people what will be happening, because they want to have the person, making their own choices and, living their life. And so they're more offering guidance from that perspective. And then you also mentioned, right, there's people that might be doing evolutionary astrology, and that's going to have a certain focus on really a lot of focus on the soul. Maybe they're talking about even past life types of impacts in some kind of way could be coming up as part of that. But definitely there's going to be a lot of discussion of internal tensions that might be playing out related to whatever issue the person is facing. And psychological is going to be different than evolutionary, but there is also a lot of focus on that internal life and what's going on with the person and how things are impacting them. I do think with psychological, there is a lot of focus also on some of that more concrete, mundane aspects of the person's life and how that's showing up for them. And I do think there's people in that dimension, as well as in the archetypal astrology dimension, and probably also in the evolutionary astrology dimension, that we'd be talking about prediction in terms of a multivalence of potential scenarios that might be showing up for the person. So, instead of just saying, Mars and Saturn are coming into an opposition. So with what's going on right now, for example, some people may not look at Uranus or Pluto or Neptune. So they're really focusing in on, we have Mars applying to oppose Saturn and what that's going to mean. Other people are going to be looking at, well, it's also, Mars is forming an air triangle with Uranus and Gemini trine and Pluto and Aquarius trine. And it's not just Mars opposing Saturn, it's Mars opposing Neptune, and this is actually the very end and beginning of a Saturn-Neptune cycle, with this whole, big configuration forming that's going to get even, it's going to be a big deal this year and next year especially, and there's a really big potential narrative playing out with that, and there's all sorts of multivalent ways that could be showing up for people. I think and then, there's also different timing techniques people use. Something that's very popular that I definitely use, and I do think it's most likely perhaps more ancient than people, or more older than people realize, is secondary progressions. And that's a technique that a lot of people doing psychological astrology will use, because especially some people will use a very concrete predictive I do think secondary progressions can work that way, but I also really use it as like a personal narrative dimension to really connect in with the life story the person is living through and where they are in that story. And it can also then be really powerful to key in on past parts of their story and reflect upon that. And that shows what's going on now and can bring added insight in their story with how to kind of navigate what they're going through right now. With secondary progressions, for example, there's a passage in Vedic Valens where it really sounds like he is talking about secondary progressions. I mean, he is basically saying what you would do if you're using an ephemeris today and just counting days and looking for when things are making, and it's just kind of thrown in when he's like listing some different things. But even the case, we know it comes up later with Placidus and trying to figure out primary directions with Ptolemy and all of that. So it's pretty old anyway. And that's one that really came back. But then depending on what type of traditional astrology you use, there's all sorts of different timing techniques out there, which I think that's starting to open up a whole nother, we don't need to go there quite yet, but that's an important dimension, is the conception of time. And for example, I think a major difference with some people would be one perspective looking at everything in the chart being really active and important and potentially manifesting something all the time. It's very dynamic. There are certain timing techniques that some astrologers might use, which are then going to focus their attention on certain parts of the chart being really active. And there's a term that's often now translated as releasing a fetus that kind of goes with that. Interestingly, since our last conversation this past week, I live in Olympia where the Cayley Library is, and Demetra George was just here with a group of us who have studied with her, and we were doing this little mini summit, and we were actually spending hours looking at different Greek words and how they're translated, and how that relates to time in these different conceptions of these time, what's now often translated as a Time Lord technique. I don't know if SJ, you want to pick up from anything that I'm talking about right now, because there's a lot more that we can get into all of this, but that's some of the major differences that I see. And then I guess also then some people are going to be some people are going to use these to really be predictive. Some people are going to really pinpoint there's this certain month, or there's these certain X periods of time, or something they're going to say something looks like it's going to happen, and there's going to be a specificity about certain areas of the life where they're expecting something's going to happen, and some people would then tell the person they're working with like what that is.
Yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah. No, I appreciate all that. It's a good, I think, delineation of some of the landscape, you might say, that's out there for people that are listening that might not, understand some of this stuff. When you were talking, Ashwin, I was thinking about and I'm going to come at this from a different angle, which is just kind of how I look at it and how I practice with a fact of these differences. And I want to come first to the idea of the house topics, because that's what I heard you at least somewhat talking about, or I think house topics are a good location to explore the differences between modern and ancient, because there's clearly things that in the ancient texts that the houses would signify that modern or more contemporary schools just have a whole different thing. And that would be a good example, like second house is resources versus self-esteem, for example, or
Taurus,
Taurus being self-esteem, or your value, Venus being values versus art, and the rubies you're going to wear or something like this. And so I think how I've tried to navigate this stuff, and this is what I would recommend to people, is one, why would we exclude? I just don't understand the idea of like a school would brand itself around cutting out certain significations, especially when it's an easy link. So for example, Venus being values, that's kind of an easy link. Like you can go to Valens and read what he says about Venus and kind of make that jump, not too hard, right? You're going to buy things that make you beautiful because you value that thing, right? There's some way to connect that. And that might be not the best example. It's just the one that's coming to me right now. You can see this sort of across the ancient tradition where if you expand just a little bit and it's clearly inclusive of some of the more contemporary expressions of an art symbol set. And so my approach has always been like, let's do both. I mean, if I'm talking, but in service of what the ISAR rules, ethics rules talks about with not harming a client, and I would just pivot that a little bit and say, how do you best serve a client? What is best serving a person that you're talking to? And so if they just had Saturn in Aries, inner Aries, and that is their third whole sign house and they're in Aquarius rising, I don't understand why I wouldn't ask, do you have a brother or a sister? Like that seems to be a very logical first place to begin, because even if I was in a more esoteric system, because the mundane event might be a literal or a gateway using maybe an ancient kind of nuts and bolts expression into what is really the deeper spiritual way that transit is going to ultimately implement. You see what I'm saying? So maybe it's like, yeah, the brother just got the diagnosis. And if I didn't ask about the siblings, then you lose, that might not even come up in the reading. And then you're in the doorway of, okay, well, what's the higher, octave of the third house, which is, spiritual. We know it's a house of communication with the gods. It's like the ninth house. There's this whole mystical side to it. And, what if the brother then, now you find out the brother is like a chaplain and, who knows what you get into. But I mean, I guess what I would tell people is I think looking for connections is maybe a good way to say it between these variety of assignations of the symbols, because I think you'll find there's often these connections. And Rudyard's great at this. This is why I love Rudyard so much, because what's the one, New Mansions for New Men? It's about the houses, and he's got all kinds of weird ways he's expressing stuff, but you can directly link it back in a lot of the cases. Like, yeah, he's talking about the first house. Boom, that's what Pretorius says, kind of the same way, and so so that's what I would say there. Let me see what else you were saying in terms of Time Lord techniques and timing. Yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother thing. And the only thing I want to say about it, or one of the most important things I would just say, is I think the technology as it developed in the tradition allows for a precision with certain measurements. And that does something to the necessity of certain techniques, because when you were casting a chart in 2,000 years ago and it took days to get the calculation and like, here's your birth chart, that's a little bit difficult to get a precise transit to even know when a planet is going to enter a sign or conjoin a planet, someone's natal planet, because those measurements were not very good, is my understanding at least, and it took a lot more time. And so, of course, you would want to develop a proxy technique that can be derived from just 1 days of calculation. Then you get that, and now you can just keep that effort and then pull out from that effort timing techniques. And I think that's my sense of what a lot of these ancient techniques were built around, was the lack of precision in terms of measuring something like transit. So I'm going to stop there, just throw that. But, yes, there's all these worlds of timing techniques. And actually, one last thing is that I think we're in a beautiful time where, yes, students are learning ancient astrology first. And then, so their arc is now coming to people like, I don't even want to say Rudyard necessarily, but someone like Forst, these other schools that are clearly way different in certain ways. And I think that's good. And I think that we're in a world where it's like kind of may the best techniques win. And I think how techniques compete for astrologers, is how I would say this, is very personal to each astrologer. And I don't think there's a right answer. I think astrologers need to go into their own inspiration. They need to go into their own creative impulse. And these are very personalized choices that astrologers are going to get to make. They're going to get to say, wow, I had a dream about secondary progressions. And then I started practicing it with these example charts and clients, and boom, I've unlocked something, and that's their technique. Go for it. Mm-hmm. But that might not be right for everybody. And so we're all kind of, it's like it's the love affair with the technique and the astrologers. We're all kind of trying to find our loves. And it's a cool world, because we'll see what survives. We'll see what techniques are going to be pulled through here when you have more competing for, the minds and hearts of astrologers. And I think whole sign houses is a great example, because a lot of us use it. we use it because it's so powerful and potent, and it unlocks symbolic layers and elegance that quadrant failed. And that's we don't have to go there, but that is a great example of like the revival of an ancient technique that then through competition has won over a lot of us because of its power. And so I'm just excited, I guess is what I'm saying, to see kind of what emerges here over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Like what will be the techniques that sort of win us over?
I think that's a good place to kind of take a nice divergence, because so I think both of you kind of started at different places and ended at the same place. And one of the things that I'm kind of reminded in both of your explanations of all this is that I did one episode with Stephen Forrest very recently, and Stephen Forrest mentioned that evolutionary astrology brings in something that is very important that psychological astrology could not bring, that is actually missing. And I think what both of you have been talking about is basically kind of trying to choose what works, be it modern or traditional. And if it kind of integrates well and fulfills a particular area in our practice or in our studies of astrology, I think that kind of makes a lot of sense to kind of integrate such techniques. And on the other hand, it's always client work. So what really works in a client session, I think supersedes any other form of what technique we are using or what kind of astrology we are using. And all this doesn't matter, but if we are able to satisfy a client and get results with what we are doing, I think that will be very good. So I think you mentioned something about the conception of time, where so some astrologers think that all the planets are always active and dynamic, and they kind of symbolize or bring something every time. And then there is the other element where only certain parts of the chart that are active and kind of manifest in terms of results. And you mentioned about experience with Demetra George, which obviously is extremely priceless. And house division. So, like, instead of talking which is better or which is good, I think it's important to kind of discuss which one we use, so that people can find value if they're able to find value. So what are your preferred house systems, Gray? Like, do you kind of switch from one system to another system or different purposes, or you just stick to
I do switch, and I tend to use whole sign and Placidus.
Okay.
That doesn't mean I won't ever consider the ramifications of like equal house, because that's just easy. You don't really have to do anything. There are some cases, when I was younger, I was using porphyry quite a bit. And then I started out using Placidus just because that's just what I knew to use. It wasn't really an intellectual decision. It was just sort of what I was seeing to use. Then I was using porphyry, and then I was using porphyry and whole sign once I realized whole sign worked really well, especially with the Hellenistic techniques. When I learned horary, I learned through Deb Holding's School of Traditional Astrology, and so I was using Regiomontanus for that. And I have to say, I did find a lot about Regiomontanus that I really liked, but by that point, I had already decided that I really liked Placidus, just because the house cusps, I just always noticed with transits, especially outer planet transits, seemed more accurate for me in my personal life with Placidus. And I also like the philosophical dimension of time with Placidus and the planetary hours. And I know there's also some really interesting mathematical aspects of Placidus that I don't think I fully honestly grasped, because I'm not as great in that dimension. But when people describe it to me, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a cool thing about Placidus also. So I tend to, at this point, I mostly use Placidus. and whole sign. And in fact, though, I with horary, I switched over to using Placidus a lot because I do prefer it with natal, and you want to look sometimes with horary and natal charts, and so it made more sense just to stick with what I already decided that I liked in terms of Placidus. And I do, because of that, I honestly do use with horary. I that's actually one where I use Placidus. I don't switch around with horary.
Okay.
But because I do use a lot of techniques related to Hellenistic astrology, that like through Demetra George, I do use whole sign quite a bit, and I keep I do feel like I probably have a tendency to go there, but I don't necessarily think whole sign is better than Placidus, for example. I would not make that that argument. I think there's definitely good things about the quadrant systems, and they're really interesting. Yeah.
So you mentioned that whole sign Placidus and Regiomontanus, and you said that you find the house cusps, especially with the outer planets, kind of seem to be making a lot more astrological impact from your analysis, which is Placidus. So do you basically for natal chart reading, you use Placidus and whole sign houses, and for horary also you shifted to Placidus. That's what you mentioned. But still, when you were studying with Deb Holding, you did Regiomontanus.
I was doing Regiomontanus, to learn it that way. And I was actually starting to consider going with Regiomontanus at that time more, because there's an interesting thing about Regiomontanus too that we don't need to get into, that is interesting the way that's calculated. And I was like, hey, this is actually pretty cool. But anyway.
SJ.
Yeah, sorry to bring up the house topic, guys. I know these could be multiple podcasts.
It's something that we had to get into, and we don't need to escape from that. Let's have this very democratic, open discussion.
Yeah. Okay. It's just, these are like one of those areas. It's the third rail kind of thing where astrologers. I mean, there's been so many wars about this. That, it's kind of that's a whole nother topic too. Like the triggers in the astrology community, and astrologers willing to kind of go at each other. Like, what are the topics that because there's something to learn there, isn't there? There's something that like tells us about ourselves and our practice. But for me, I just use whole sign. I don't know if you're asking me that, and
that's
it's
exactly what I'm asking.
I'm not I'm not against any systems at all. For my practice, I just resonate with it greatly and strongly, and a lot of it has to do with the just some of the philosophical underpinnings when you read some of these older texts. Particularly, I'll just say the exact thing that really won me over, which is that, well, there's a lot, but you can pull up charts where Jupiter is exactly trining the ascendant and applying, and yet it's in the 8th house. And I just never could logically square that, because the trine aspect is of its nature a free-flowing supportive trine, and you look at some of these ancient writings about aspects, and it's about the affinity between elements, and so to have such a beautiful Jupiter in the chart, and then to say, well, that's a death Jupiter because it's in the 8th house, I just couldn't square it logically. My brain kind of broke. Now, I know there's probably a good answer from quadrant people, and they're going to go into the nuances of what that might mean. But so there's that side of it. And I just think so much of, at least how I read charts, is about the interaction between planets with other planets based on their assignments over sectors, aka rulership. And you get some real elegance with seeing just these kind of matches using affinity with the zodiac. And that to me is captured in the whole sign system, because houses get to ride with that model as opposed to, defragmented or, create dissonance around that model. I just would say the last thing is that the cusp issue too. I mean, there's so many. I'm curious I'm just as a practitioner, Gray, what you're using and what you'd say to this, because I haven't really gotten to talk to someone as much, and it's been a while. But there's the 3-degree rule, the 5-degree rule, the 7-degree rule. I know there's variance amongst practitioners. There's different calculations of quadrant systems, so you have a range for the cusps. It just feels like some of those house cusps, eventually you get a wide degree range of where even a house begins, and I couldn't square that with my logic brain. Whereas when you do tropical, and this is a whole nother Ashwin, I don't mean to bring it there, but it's on this point of precision and exactitude in terms of the measurements we're using, which for me is a great value as just a conceptual thing. You know, tropical with whole sign, there's a precision where you know where the sign is, you know, and begins and starts and ends, and you know where the house begins and starts and ends. And to me, that kind of satisfies something in me. Whereas others, I think, are less concerned about that. And that might say more about my personality and my, you know, what I want as an astrologer than anything else. But, you know, that's where I'm at with it. And one other quick thing here, there was a paper, Martin Ganston wrote the paper a few years back. You guys saw that paper, big deal, right? He published it. I remember getting it, reading it, scouring it, going through a little. And, you know, I think he makes some good points, and I'm not even trying to debate the historicity of it because I think it's unclear. But I think Ganston, Holden, Hand, Brennan, they're all going to agree that the whole sign system was a system. And Holden claims it was just like the astrology of the street, where people are using it as a kind of a street astrology because it was simpler, but she even acknowledges it was street astrology. So I'm fine with practicing street astrology. You know, I'm fine with using that kind of those systems. And it relates to what we talked about in the last talk, which is what's the mechanism of why this even works? If the mechanism is some kind of divine overlay that's independent of astrology itself, that our divination tools are actually just gateways into a divine energy that's using whatever tool we choose to give us data and information to help us, then I don't think it really matters one way or the other. It's just more about how we feel inspired and connected to that other realm, that information realm. So yeah, I mean, that's how I practice with it. And, you know, I know, anyhow, people have an answer back, and there's good answers in these debates, and they've been fruitful a lot. And I was just thinking about it last night, actually, because Wade Caves has this thing where if you use whole sign houses, the moon will, though it's moving forward, because the moon can never retrograde, it will actually move houses backward. So the moon can go from the 12th house to the 11th house in whole sign, even though the moon is moving forward. And for him, that's like the major argument. That's the round winner, right? That's the determinative point that he can't square it logically, why he wouldn't use quadrant houses. So, you know, we all have our own preferences. Real quick, Gray, are you using a 5-degree rule or a range?
I do. 5 degree is what I do.
Is it precise technical, or do you have a little range? Like if it's 5 degrees and 10 degree minutes, do you pull it in, or is there a range there with? Because I know some people.
I like. I'm a little William Lilly, I'd say, in terms of like, you know, William Lilly says he might have like these certain rules, but you see him practicing and he's being pretty intuitive. It seems like divinatory with what he's doing. And I would say I like that approach. Yeah, but I think about a 5 degree. I don't think about 7 or 3. I think you said 3.
Yeah.
It's more like, and like I said, I honestly, because I do use so many Hellenistic things, I have a really strong. I'm often doing whole sign, but I always like look to see what's happening from the other perspective, because I feel like they're all operating at the same time. Like 2 different astrologers will look at it, you know, and have, so, you know, but yeah, 5 degrees I do look at.
With like a kind of sense, if it maybe is a little wider, you might pull it in. If like it's clear you're talking to the client, that it just kind of, because that's the other thing of birth time calculation. So we should bring this up here too. That I get a birth certificate with a precise time, not accurate. It might not even be accurate. So I don't even like the ascendant. And I'll share this with you guys because it's kind of relevant. Lately, I've been preferring just to take all degrees off my charts. I don't even want to see the degrees. And, you know, I know that's a little bit heretical, so I'm going to drop that hot take. But,
no, it's very relevant. I'll tell you why.
But I think it's an interesting
approach.
Yeah, but the thing is, part of it is that you can't even rely on an ascendant. And so, you know, rectifying the proper rising sign to me gets me in the door comfortably. And now I can use a more Dorothean or Valens style where you pull up their chart examples. There's not even a breadth of a degree when they're delineated, or Firmicus even. I think it's very rare. There may be 1 or 2, but basically they're operating on a purely sign-based house topic engagement between planets. And that'll take you far, man. You know, and it's not that I ignore degrees. Okay. I mean, if you got something exactly on a planet, yeah, you want to tell someone that, especially if they're interested in that. But I don't think you need to. I think you can capture, like, let's come back to our Saturn and Aries example. Let's say that person has the IC in the third house, 27 degrees. Would you want to tell them Saturn and Aries coming into their third whole sign house that, like, would you not talk about that? Because it's only when it hits that 28th degree that it's somehow going to be operative. I don't think so. I think, and I've seen it enough in practice, that those stories emerge immediately upon an ingress into a new sign house. And sometimes that's the loudest moment where it all happens. And yeah, maybe there's another peak there as it gets close. But I find, and I wanted to say this earlier, because I find this idea, and it relates to the timing technique, a concept where sometimes with Time Lords, and this is eventually where I got with Time Lords, because I used to use a lot of them, and then I realized everything's a Time Lord. That by definition, it just depends on what technique you're going to use to make it the Time Lord. And it, for example, progression, not progression. Sorry, I can't think. Annual perfections.
Yeah,
you can perfect from every house. So it's a Time Lord by what house you're perfecting from. You can perfect from anything. So everything's a Time Lord. And so when I heard that, then I realized, okay, why would I, as an astrologer, and it relates to what I was saying earlier about using house topics and like trying to sever out the psychological or sever out the more functional. And I just don't get why we would want to do that as a starting place. Now, you may want to home in on something with someone if it becomes clear that's where the meat of the conversation is. But I feel the same way about Time Lords. Like, you know, why would I? It's because some people will do this to say, well, you're in a first house perfection year. And what they mean is from the sign of the ascendant, they're in that perfection year. And so they're going to pick just the domicile lord of that ascendant. And that's the only planet they want to talk about. Like, I to me, that really can remove very powerful things that might be the core of what's operating in someone's chart. I just saw enough chart examples where I was like, I just can't do this anymore.
Absolutely. So I agree with you on that for sure.
So anyhow, just to come back to that, I think the time, like, we have to, I don't know, I'm more like casting the wide net, and then you quickly get with someone and your astrologer sense will kind of bring out things that to me, and we have to just kind of trust our instincts. And this is where client dialogue is really important, because you need to be with the client to start talking to them to get even a sense of what's happening, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the things that kind of wanted to bring up is that you don't use the degrees. So small tidbit information here is that astrologers in India who still kind of write charts with their hand, still they don't give any degrees in the chart when they write it. So my own chart, birth chart, which was written probably 10 or 11 days after I was born, doesn't have degrees. So it's just handwritten chart placements and all the other essentials, but there won't be any degrees. And it's still a very common practice in India, where there will be a notebook and astrologers just read based on the placement. So nothing else is really given in there. And another interesting thing is Placidus and Regiomontanus, but I think Anthony Lewis again mentioned that Regiomontanus tried to understand that one particular passage from Ptolemy and ended up giving his own version, which was not necessarily accurate. And it turned out to be the Regiomontanus system, but Placidus was more accurate in understanding what Ptolemy was doing with the technique that he wanted to do in terms of directing the high leg and calculating the length of life. So I just wanted to kind of mention, and I think I had conversations with Anthony Lewis, around that period when he did this episode with Chris Brennan. So that one episode was again very eye-opening. So yeah, and then like usage of outer planets. So I don't use outer planets and I don't use quadrant systems. So I don't know if I will be able to offer anything at all. So I'll let you both to kind of deal with how do outer planets help in your interpretations, and what is your experience with it, and why should people use it, and how do you use it? That is most important thing, so that people will try and kind of figure out same, something from what they get inspired from.
Yeah, well, I mean, I grew up learning outer planets, and I mean, when I first was exposed to astrology, I was seeing information about Jupiter ruling Pisces as a co-ruler, but I was definitely seeing information that was telling me Neptune rules Pisces. So, that is some of the first conceptions of astrology that I just had, was that these outer planets were really actually fundamental. So really from the beginning, I was considering them and wanting to understand them. And because they work so powerfully for me, I could never not look at them. I mean, and I know I've heard some astrologers be like, well, they're kind of like fixed stars, and they're definitely not fixed stars. They're completely different. They're not, and that, even so, I don't use, for example, all the centaurs, but I always look at Chiron. And for many years now, I used to put some of the more of the asteroids on, in terms of the original Demetra George, real strong focus on Pallas Athena, Juno, and Ceres and Vesta. And though what I've used for many years now is I actually will have there's 12 signs. I use 12 planets, because Ceres isn't an asteroid. Ceres deservedly was reclassified as a dwarf planet. She's spherical. She actually has water, which the other planets can't even claim. And I think Ceres to me is powerful, and she does not need to operate around some of the rules people place on asteroids. And Chiron to me, same, is really powerful. So I always do include Pluto, and then I add in Ceres and Chiron. And my friend Jason Hawley and I actually this past spring taught a course that we call the Twilight Planets, and we sort of, often not traditional, but it's like our own idea of a twilight sect, which would be Mercury, Chiron, and Ceres. And then, just for what it's worth, it was very powerful, and that concept really works from a certain perspective. If you're thinking about what twilight consciousness is compared to day consciousness or night consciousness. So I always look at the outer planets because I find them really powerful. Now with different Time Lord techniques, I do still consider them. And there's things like when we like with annual perfections, I might note that I'm not going to look at them as ruling a house. And when I've taught zodiacal releasing, I always want the students to focus on the traditional 7 planets. But I do have to say, I consistently notice that it seems like those outer planets have something to say when they are activated in a period. And I've done consultations with people that work with asteroids, for example. I remember this one person, they were like, they know their chart so well with the asteroids. They kept being like, oh, that means, Pallas Athena was doing this thing then at the zodiacal releasing period. And I was like, well, yeah, totally makes sense, actually. Yeah, I don't know if Esther, you want to say some stuff about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, just to trace a little bit of my journey, because you did that too. And as I was listening to you, I was like, it does make sense what we're trained in, or what we're exposed to, what we're brought up in. That really can influence, like a child. As you expose a child as they're maturing in those early phases, it highly influences the adult that child will become. My story is kind of strange because I was involved in tarot, and I studied the tarot for a few years before I became an astrologer, as a result of a chance meeting with Jen Zart. That's a whole nother story. But and then the systems I was studying with the tarot was, Golden Dawn, Crowley, and some of the older traditions that were out of that little occult pocket of our heritage, you might say. And they were very much focused on the 7 classical planets or the 7 traditional planets within that system. And so those were the only planets that were included in terms of correspondence systems with the deck of tarot cards. And that's what I was working with for a few years before I met Jen, and she like initiated me, is how I say it. It was this really strange, trippy thing, by the way. We can talk about that at some point if you want. And then I became an astrologer basically that day and was obsessed with astrology and read every book I could find. And I went to all my libraries in Austin and checked out literally everything there was and just tried to find the information. And it was confusing. It's like, what the hell? Like people weren't talking about the same thing. It was like books from, different decades. There was no way to cohere everything I was reading into a system. And so I realized, okay, I guess I need to take a course to do this. That was my goal. But it was a Deb Holding article that sort of began, for me, the systems that I use today, the birth of those systems. And it was a Dorotheus article about Trigon Lords of the Sect-Light. Mm. And so even the way that they were drawing the houses was different because it was a square chart. And it was just very clear, like, okay, this I can see, I can perceive the geometry of it even. And there was no degrees, and it was just, okay, you have your day chart, night chart, what houses are the sect-light rulers in, and that's the first third of life, second third of life, third third of life. Is it a positive house, weak house? And then you could tell the narrative very clearly without all of this other stuff that can be quite overwhelming, right? Just a flood of overwhelm. So that was my backdrop. Then I, of course, learned the outer planets and all of that, and I learned astrology, and I, have some functional ability to use them. So fast forward to today, and so that's like the backdrop, just so you know my background. I like doing readings. I like just looking at more of a Dorotheus style chart with the 7. And I think they're very powerful to do only that. Okay. But, and I say but because I don't read that way. I mean, I have a default chart that I use with clients. That chart includes outer planets, because part of why I do that is I found a lot of the clients I read for are astrology adjacent or enthusiasts, and they want to talk about that other stuff, and they're hiring me to talk to them about what they want to talk about. Maybe later in my career, I might just say, no, you're going to come into my world. We're going to pull up like a square chart without degrees with 7 traditional. I might do that at some point and just kind of fully go with maybe what I would want to do. But I meet my clients where they want to be met. And so logically, how I've decided to do it is that I see there's the 7, right? There's astronomical categories. And that's kind of helped me to figure out how to like delineate all this. But you have the 7, right? Boom. We know everybody, we can see those, and that in our astrological traditions, they're a clear category. Okay, boom. So we have that. What do you now choose to put in? If you're going to start putting other stuff in, how do you go about doing that in terms of a logic? And Uranus and Neptune. Uranus gets in, it's partly visible, and it is clearly a planet astronomically. Neptune, clearly a planet astronomically. Both get in. So I would look at charts with just those 2 and the 7. That's a category for me. And it would just be the planets, astronomical planets. Now, if I'm going to let in Pluto, I want to let in the other astronomical dwarf planets. So I want to let in Ceres with Pluto. And I've, by the way, done a lot of readings in the last, like this year, where Ceres has been really important. It comes up a lot, especially in astrocartography. I've seen it being highly relevant. And that's after our friend down in Arizona, his name's escaping me now.
Moses
Shiragar.
Yeah.
Moses, yeah, he's got the whole thing about Ceres. But even before that, I always included it. But then he's coming out and said it's the 3rd benefic, and then astrocartography, you want to look for that. So I started paying attention to it in that context. And I've seen it with people using an astrocartography context where it's, they're living near that Ceres line, and it's been potent. And I'll get to this, just bear with me a couple more minutes, or a minute or two here. But, so then the thing is, there's a software question, because I want to put in, there's currently 5 official dwarfs, and there's Make, Humea, Ceres, Eris, and Pluto. The thing about, so I have Eris, Solar Fire only lets me have Eris, Ceres, and Pluto. So I always have those in my default chart. And the thing about COVID was an Eris Pluto hard aspect. There's a whole thing where Eris, and we need these in our software. We need them in the default. We need to let researchers go after this stuff. There's limits, I guess is what I'm saying right now, because we don't have a full embrace with the software integrating the dwarf planets. And I think that's an area where we can improve on over the next couple of decades. I think Astro Gold for iOS. I don't have Mac, but I think they're doing some good integration there. SolarFire's way behind. I messaged them and they're like, they just blow you off. You know, I'm sorry to attack them a little bit here, but I said, hey, you know, just a nice email. And they're just like, we don't take requests. Don't ask us to do anything with our software. It was just quite, so there, I raise it only to say there's not like an energy behind this with that software, though it's my software that I default with. So, what I would say in terms of my practice, that aside, so then I have these default charts. I throw Chiron on mainly because people want to talk about it. That's why I have it in. And I want to close this little two more points, and then they'll be done. But I do find that when Pluto is with Venus, okay, close, it's going to influence it. I mean, there's a layer of that I think is worth bringing in, or at least checking in with people. And now I'm telling you guys what I've seen in my practice, and so if I do put the outer planets in, what I think is a useful way to do it. If Ceres is right with Mercury. So I view them more as blending points with the 7, I call them Knights of the Round Table. The Round Table is the 12 signs and houses. The Knights are the ones that are assigned dominion. And then you have these other things that can blend with those Knights. And so I do use them in that sense. I mean, I want to know if Pluto Saturn exists, and then there's a Plutonic edge. So that's how I functionally use it. I will say in mundane astrology, whole different thing. And yes, those cycles are undeniably, amazingly accurate. So I think we need, you know, just to, say that as it clearly doing that. And then the final thing I want to raise here, there's a book by Greer, the translator with Warnock. I don't know if you guys have seen this book. It just came out in the last 2 or 3 years. It's about Pluto. I think it's called The Twilight of Pluto.
I have it. Yeah.
But he's positing something that to me, I think feels right to me. And not that Pluto's going to die. I don't know if he's right about that. But what I do think is that we create the points that are relevant discursively in the larger, you know, astrological discourse, meaning that our clients are exposed to this like co-created astrological construct, which is the meaning set that we culturally then are interfacing with. And so that is as much a determiner in my view of what's important to talk about as what I want to talk about. And that's why I'm ready to receive clients. Let's talk about your Chiron. I've learned about Chiron. I read some books about it. I got my Chiron chops up enough to be able to offer something useful to people because that's in the discourse. And that's been, that's why we have to meet that as much as avoid that, you might say. But anyhow, I think it's interesting what it will become over the next several decades. Like, will Make take on some huge importance? Or Ceres, I think, is back. I mean, as you mentioned, and it's coming back because it's closer to us than the trans-Neptunian. It's like, I think Ceres should be studied more as a planet, as a dwarf planet. And so anyhow, those are my thoughts on that. And I will say, I do think there's utility, just to bring it back, like just turning everything off, put the 7 on, look at the sign houses, and like that's going to get you a whole lot of stuff. And it's a really workable system that can add a ton of value to your life. And, you know, so that's kind of my preferred default way to practice with people.
You know, I feel like I kind of time traveled 2000 years ago and came here. I don't know what you're talking about, Ceres or Ares. I never heard of all these things. and who the hell is this host? Okay. Anyway, so that's brilliant. I think there are so many things that that I have to learn to start with, except that time is very limited. But yeah, I think at least those people who are watching this or listening to this might have enough idea to see how they can integrate all these modern planets and, you know, the dwarf planets or asteroids into their work. So that apart, so coming back to the final thing and also the main thing, which is the time lot systems and the timing techniques. So what are your preferred techniques, and you know, for what purposes do you use these techniques?
The one that I mean, if I had to pick one absolute favorite, I would say secondary progressions, just because I have the most experience with it. It's the first one technique like that I've found really early on in my practice that I could see worked really well. And then I've just spent the longest time doing it, I feel like it's one that's just like so reliable to me that it's always like so, to me, incredibly accurate. So I would never not look at secondary progressions, and it's pretty rare for me to not even, I think I pretty much always say something typically about secondary progressions in every reading. And, you know, I could do a whole one just focused on it as well. You know, when we were talking about Time Lords earlier, the thing with them is I agree with a lot of what SJ was saying. One, with perfections, right? You can perfect from anything. So there's all these different combinations that can be active in any time, like a 12th house year, you know, Val to say every single 12th relationship in the entire chart is automatically happening and handing over to one another. And but with perfections, when I do that, what I focus on is the ascendant, sun, moon, and lot of fortune are the ones that I always look at, and I give more precedence to the ascendant, lot of fortune, and the sect light. And that's just like what I typically look at there. And then I've come to really like zodiacal releasing. I don't always use that with people though. Sometimes people are coming to me specifically to talk about that. And even in that case, I usually will still start talking about secondary progressions and some other stuff because like something's going on and I'll just hear them talking like, well, this is what's happening. You're describing this and this is lining up exactly with this or this. It might be a Pluto transit even, you know, even though they're asking about zodiac releasing, but obviously I would focus on that then. But the thing with the Time Lords that I always think about, they are really interesting, and I think there's a lot of value to them in that conception of time. And the thing is, sometimes numerous Time Lord systems can converge upon one or two planets, and that's particularly powerful. I feel like an idea that's out there that's pretty popular right now is the list that Rhetorius made, placing, whether you want to call it circumambulations of the bounds or distributions or something else. You know, he does give that some priority, and then something like zodiacal releasing folding underneath that, and then perfections even lower. But what's interesting about that, right? Some people just want to look at one perfection and then see that nothing else. Don't worry about Venus being retrograde on your Saturn because Saturn's not your Time Lord, or Venus isn't your Time Lord. And I don't personally do that in my. That's not the way I look at it. And there's so many ones to look at that I think it is so someone else might really love Ferdaria. I am someone that Ferdaria is still one that I want to do more with, but like it hasn't spoken to me like some of the others. One that I'm increasingly getting more into is circumambulations, but I feel like people get drawn towards one in particular. Some people just prefer primary directions, which has some similarities, but there's notable differences. So with circumambulations or distributions. So, but I do think this conception of time is really interesting and what it focuses on. Now, one thing that's different from me than I've noticed other people, like for, let's say, zodiacal releasing, I only look at releasing from the lot of daimon and the lot of fortune. I also don't think releasing from the lot of fortune is just about health issues. I think it's about the experience of the soul incarnated into a body and everything in the material realm, including material prosperity. And but I think this is a fascinating to me dimension of soul the lot of fortune being like our experience of a soul incarnated into a body, the lot of daimon being a lot of the sun, this animating force within the soul, inspiring us to take action. And we are creating we're creating narrative timing structures out of these 2 points. That's giving us an interesting story of time and time releasing across these stretches of time, and then these dynamic tensions of different planets activating within that narrative. And that's different than what another timing structure is going to give you, whether that's like decennials or, circumambulations moving through the bounds, and then different planets coming in with an aspect and showing up as something. So it's potentially a lot of information. I know there's some astrologers that really look at all these things at once, but I think it's really a practice of what you want to focus on. But to answer your question, yeah, I'm primarily secondary progressions, transits. I'll look at perfections, I'll look at zodiacal releasing, increasingly looking at circumambulations, but it will also depend on what's going on with the person, Yeah.
Sure. I think what's going on with the person, that's more important.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I really love that SJ was, because remember, the really important thing is to actually talk to them and ask them questions.
Yeah, I think that's
and then see
one of
where
the roles as an
what that's
astrologer.
going to go. Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes we are in a very difficult territory where it's sometimes we cannot say something directly to them, and we have to kind of pick words from their mouth by asking questions, and they end up saying something that we already saw in the chart. So, but it might not be something that we can openly say to them. Yeah. So, SJ, do you have any preferred timing techniques, or you just go by the charts calling?
No, I'll throw out my little take on this, and I would say I want to come back to that. Just what you were saying there, the chart example, Saturn the third, okay, in Aries. So we've got. I like sometimes just having a little chart example as a through line, and they say, okay, what anything with your brother? And they say, yeah, he's been sick. Let's say we're talking in April this year, and we know Saturn's about to enter the third house. I mean, do you tell them, well, that could take a turn for the worse? I don't think there's a lot of phrasing.
Yes.
Choices that we make as astrologers, and that's as much of our skills as anything else, is knowing how to communicate things in ways that are loving and supportive and useful. That my goal, and I wanted to come back here because someone, I think, Aswin, you said earlier, what works for the client. There was this concept of, does it work? And then my immediate thought was, how do we define that? Like, what's the actual goal when you meet with a client? What are we trying to have to produce in them such that when the reading's over, it's a good reading? What would that even mean? And I think part of my definition for that is that I want them to feel, inspired, connected to themselves, aligned with maybe a true purpose, spiritually aligned. Like, these are my definitions for what a good reading would be. Like, it's going to trigger in them some spiritual awareness or some kind of hopeful, positive energies, rather than saying, hey, Saturn's entering Aries. There could be indicators here that he's going to take a turn for the worse. And you have Jupiter in your 8th and at the same time. So this would be a 3-6. Let's say, well, I think Jupiter will get to Virgo while Saturn is still in Aries in 2027. So that would be like Saturn in the 3rd, Jupiter in the 8th. And it's like, okay, he's going to die. You're going to have a Jupiterian expansion in the house of death, Saturn in the 3rd. I mean, we know as astrologers that could be one likely delineation, and it might be more likely just with that basic symbol outlay. We still don't know. Like, it doesn't have to be that, but I wouldn't tell them. Anyway, I just wanted to say that as you were transitioning to me there, on that point of how we talk about this with our clients and how powerful that can be, and how we need to be, wise and loving. And okay, let me shift to the other question, which is what timing techniques I use. I studied with Chris. I learned a lot of them. I used to have different histories with all kinds of stuff. All right. And it all collapsed for me effectively at a certain point into transits. And that's my number one timing technique. That's my number one predictive technique, because what was happening, and it was what Gray mentioned earlier, I would be talking with someone about perfections, And then you start having the conversation and it's like, well, this whole transit was telling the story, like exactly. And I would end up talking about that. And so these timing techniques were like a gateway into my preferred technique anyway. And so I just cut it out. I just cut them out. Now I had since have resurrected some of the techniques, and the only main one that I brought back is zodiacal releasing, which is strange because that's the one where there's the least written about, and it's kind of the most arcane in a certain way. But I've just found it to be usable and useful, and I mainly use it again as a gateway into a transit conversation. But it's the dates. That's what's so powerful for me that I've seen these high level, like level 1 changes or loosing of the bonds on level 2. Those can be highly accurate when there's like a major turning point in someone's life. And I usually just leave it at that. I don't want to layer in, well, it's a peak period, so it's this or that. I kind of, the qualitative side of it, I'm less interested in. I'm more interested in as a just a timing piece. And then you can come into the chart and say, all right, these transits, when you were having a loosing of the bond, wow, that's what's happening. That's actually the meat on the bone for the timing. So it's confirming to go look at that time and start narrativizing around that. So, and I just, a couple more things, but this is why I think transits would have been, in my sense, and this is just my hypothesis, but it relates to, again, the technology. We live in an age where we know exactly when, I can tell you precisely when the ascendant is going to change signs, like down to a few seconds or milliseconds based on my latitude and longitude and the software tools we have. And it's a snap of a finger. And so I think that gives transits now a precision of accuracy with a measurement that allows them to sort of take their proper place, in my view. Whereas 2,000 years ago, they didn't even calculate the zodiac right. We're having to back calculate, like they say they're using a tropical zodiac, but it's 8 degrees off because they couldn't get Aries 1 right. And so some of it is that for me that I think that's the reason why I think they're so powerful, is that we have the calculation tools now to let them unleash their power. This is the one other thing I wanted to say on this final point here. This is a little bit of another kind of hot take, but I learned this from watching Robert Hand, by the way. He's probably my most powerful mentor, and I don't even know if I've met him directly. I've seen him in the audience, and I've read a lot of his works, and I consider him a great teacher of mine. But it's the natal chart as a predictive technique, and I think that's undersold, and I use that a lot with clients. Sometimes you just turn everything off. Let's throw on your natal chart, and let's talk about, what Saturn. Let's say this Saturn in Aries. What did we say earlier? There was the IC there. And let's say they have Venus on the IC. Let's say they have Mercury on the IC and they're at Aquarius rising. So the natal chart has Mercury on the IC in the 3rd house in Aries, and they're Aquarius rising. So sometimes it's just turn everything off. Like, you've determined Saturn's there, you've determined it might be tough, right? And then you have to just go to the natal chart. Well, what is Mercury? Communication, informational exchange. It does really well in Aquarius. And so I think it rules the ascendant personally. So it's a ruler of the ascendant. It's right on the IC point, right in Aries. So it's like, maybe it's time to get active with there's all kinds of things there you can pull out just from that symbolism to sort of predict for someone how they might want to lean into that symbol set and therefore create their future. So like, maybe you want to train with your brother. He's wounded right now, but he can get healthy, but he needs someone to train with him. Like, and maybe you have free time right now. Great. You got Mercury there. That's siblings, that's games. Aries is training. It's right in the 3rd. Like, hey, go meet him once a week, take him to the gym and start learning how to do, like, let's say I'm just like making this up on the fly, but let's say they're in a wheelchair. That's not going to change, but then they're going to work their upper body, and there's a like paraplegic Olympics or paraplegic Olympic games. And that would fit that symbolism of the natal chart so precisely that you can sort of predict with that. You can say, okay, do that. That's emerged. And then, so there's that. And then the final thing, there was 2 final things. It's the facts on the ground of the life is predictive. It is predictive, actually. You make that prediction because you asked about the brother, you found out about the brother's condition, you found out about all of these things that allow you to then predict the future. That's what even non-astrological predictive tools are. They're gathering data to make logical guesses about the future. And so I think, anyhow, I know I didn't really unpack that as deeply as we could here. I just want to close it down. But, using the facts of the life and the natal chart alone is a very powerful predictive technology.
Yeah.
And I use that in conjunction with the transits as my two number one predictive tools. And then I would have that ZR occasionally. And then whatever they want to ask about, I'll pull it up if they want to ask about. I get people saying, what's my solar return a lot? Because that's kind of in vogue. And I'll pull up the solar return. We can talk about it a little bit. I have my preferred way to treat that very quickly. But so, okay, those are my answers there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that I didn't really prioritize it, but honestly, I would be very similar to you, especially with transits. Like, and even when I mentioned having maybe looked at all those different perfections, I'm not going to probably even necessarily I may or may not talk to someone about any of that, depending. It would sort of be based upon what you're saying, what they're saying. And if I've looked ahead of time to see that something because of one of these techniques is activated, then I might be like led there. But I agree with you that actually exactly what you just said, but just figuring out what's going to be helpful for the person. And the thing that I really rely a lot on transits, just more so than I think other of my peers. I feel like that are into Hellenistic astrology or other forms. I feel like a lot of people that have gone down that path are very much into, in some cases, they like the timing techniques a lot, perhaps even more than transits. But it's also sort of how I learned astrology, is very transit based, and I find a lot of value in them, just like you were describing there.
Yeah, it's an interesting, just to follow up on that quickly, like we're in an interesting world where there are, like, so if you come back to the origin of this podcast, you're like, okay, we want to explore you two. You said, Ashwin, you feel like Gray and I are people that are using like ancient and modern and kind of blending them together. And that's one of the areas of my practice where I think it is quite modern, but still ancient, because, you know, I use a Hellenistic architecture is what I call it. And what I mean by that is sign-based, and a sign-based structure, but then a really reliant on transits. So it's like literally the ancient and then the modern, because it's the modern tech that allows me to have that precision. So that's where I'm kind of bringing those two together, I think, most of my personal practice.
What you said about Aquarius and Mercury is a good example, because I don't think you mean the modern, I don't know when it came in, but at some point people start saying the exaltation of Mercury as Aquarius. You mean because of Mercury's being a triplicity lord of Aquarius. So that's a really good example of coming from that perspective, but then tying that into a transit. And yeah,
exactly. And that's one other thing. I mean, the ancient rulership is something I'm really into, and I really love it. And I love the triplicity lords. I use them all the time in natal astrology as rulers, sometimes as important as other rulers. I got this from Rob Hand, by the way. He's got an article that he was writing a series on star IQ, and you might have been around then, Gray, I don't know, or Ashwin, that was like Rick Levine's website in the .com era. But Rob Hand, it was called Astrology by Hand. Isn't that a cool pun? But they've archived that series on astro.com, so you can go read. But he's got an article about George W. Bush's nativity. And the whole point of it, at one part of that article, is that over Sagittarius, the sun rules Sagittarius. And it explains and unlocks the whole thing about George W. Bush's chart. That without that, if you hadn't looked at the sun, as I said, having dominion over Sagittarius, you lose a whole big component there. And I've just seen it repeatedly once I keyed myself into that with clients. It's like, and it may be more important. I don't think so, but you definitely, like over Aquarius, there's a bunch of signs where there's one domicile lord, or there's a domicile lord and a exaltation lord that are the same, Virgo. So where else are you going to go? You have to kind of use these triplicity lords to try to get some additional information. And there's that layer of it, but then there's also the layer of like the concept of Aquarius and technology. This was a big war a few years ago. People are like, Aquarius is not technology. They were like, and they're angry about it. These are certain traditional astrologers. And it's like, well, Mercury is technology. Betty Fallon says it's innovation. Aquarius is an air sign.
Technological
Saturn, I
innovation.
think, is technology too, by the way.
Yeah,
New
it's
foundations.
Manilius, it's all like irrigation systems and building networks of technology, which is also it's a very obvious metaphor for today and information networks. I feel like it's not a strange leap to that, I don't think. And Saturn also can be obviously tech that too. Yeah.
Obviously. And so, but that Mercury really brings it home. And you do that with the signs, and you can see how certain archetypes like Cancer with Jupiter, obviously it's an excitation lord, but anyhow, we don't want to get off too much into this, but I think expanding rulership over the signs of the zodiac can really inform the archetypes in certain cases.
And so you would just think Mercury in general with Aquarius versus whether or not it's a day or night chart, you would just kind of automatically think Mercury and Saturn. Yeah. Well, Saturn, obviously, that's not a good example, but yeah, just bringing Mercury in also. Yeah.
Definitely. And that's after Dorotheus. There's a bunch of examples where he doesn't make a distinction between day and night. He uses both the day and night ruler in some of the delineation.
Yeah.
It's after Paulus, who does the same thing and who writes about signs of the zodiac. When he does his little zodiac list and he's putting everything in that's important, he only includes the two triplicity lords that are day and night, and he just says, here they are too. Like, we think about a zodiac sign, he's listing a bunch of things and he throws only those two in, not the supporting lord. So I think there's some textual support for doing that too, where you know, to understand the archetype, you're seeing what those lords are and you're bringing them into the conversation.
Yeah, I think there are many layers to integrate. So then triplicity lords, terms, decans. So it just goes on and on. So I think one last thing is rulerships. Like, do you use do you put in modern rulerships or traditional rulerships?
No, I don't use any mod. I just use the 7 planets ruling the 12 houses.
Okay, so I think that kind of pretty much sums it up. So, and you know, this was a great discussion, and I was happy to be kind of, you know, just watch and enjoy this dialogue. So I think ultimately it's important to kind of recognize that there needs to be a reconciliation of traditional and modern, and then it's not about choosing which is better or not choosing one over the other, but I think it's important to understand which deepens our craft in terms of how it helps the client work, and also try to understand things through dialogue, like what we are doing today, which helps us discern and also gain respect for both the traditions, because both of these have lived experiences. So I think somewhere respect also comes. So this is not necessarily a crossroad, but it is most likely an opportunity to kind of, you know, see how we can bring these together. And maybe after 50 years, there will be just one astrology. We don't know. You know, it's just astrology. Like,
I'm laughing because I doubt it, but yeah, sorry, go ahead. Knowing us, man, there's going to be. Astrologers are astrologers. So yeah, I think without losing clarity and without getting into the intricacies of techniques or intricacies of esotericism or divination, whatever it is, just be there, level-headed, and enjoy doing astrology. And that's it. I think that pretty much brings this discussion to close. So do you have anything else that's coming up apart from what you mentioned in episode 1?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, I'll be teaching a zodiacal releasing course for Kepler College. It starts October 24th or 25th. It's whatever Saturday that is. And that is up in the Kepler College store now. You can get an early discount. And that is actually part of, just relative to our discussion here, there are 2 certificates in Hellenistic astrology now available through Kepler College. There's a natal one and a timing technique one. Like Cameron Cassidy is teaching decennials right now as we're talking, as part of that timing technique. So if you're interested in zodiacal releasing, there are other timing techniques that you can do, like decennial, circumambulations, minor periods, and so etc., that you can end up getting a certificate through Kepler College if that's of interest.
Yeah, I think my friend Jolly Knot has really good feedback or nice things to say about your course. So I most certainly recommend people to join. I think in addition to that, Anthony Liu is also doing primary directions, which is
He
also kind
is,
of
yeah, he is doing primary
Hellenistic.
directions. There's going to be a medieval, I think they're calling it a medieval certificate.
Yeah, okay.
And there may end up being a traditional diploma down the line that, you could do Anthony Liu's primary directions, and we have Nadia Anderson doing circumambulation of the bounds, and that could all end up going towards a diploma. Yeah.
Cool. Revival, true revival of the tradition. So how about you, SJ?
Nothing. Just making videos on YouTube so people can find me there. That's kind of where I just share my stuff, and I'll be also maybe with on this podcast at some point later in the year. I don't want to get too far out ahead if you're not ready to.
It's already there. We are doing that.
But the thing is, the reason why I say that is that there's I'm seeing now 2026 people are starting to launch their year ahead brand. I saw someone announced their big panel. I think it was Stormy Grace. So I was realizing if I'm going to be with you, that's kind of the next thing that's like a big collab that I'll be doing. I know that might sound minor to people, but I think that's in my mind. I'm like, shoot, I got to get into that year, and I got to start thinking about
that's definitely a thing. Mm-hmm.
There's a thing. So yeah, I look forward to kind of that episode as well. And there are a few ideas that I still have to kind of work with the both of you. And I think I might reach out at some point after September. But I think that pretty much brings us to the end of this discussion. And I think you can reach Greg Crawford at graycrawford.net and sjanderson144.com. So that's it. And for any details about CAPISAR, please visit www.capisar.org. And if you have any questions or anything else, just send an email to info@capisar.org, and then feel free to subscribe to the newsletter, because CAPISAR sends a lot of newsletters. Our board is extremely active and they're super productive. So enjoy the newsletters and enjoy the shows. And thank you so much. I'll see you next time.